to today's talk by Dr. Sona Kazemi on how to build transnational feminist solidarity. Dr. Kazemi currently is a postdoctoral researcher, as you can see on the presentation slide, with the Society of Fellows, Human Rights Pasts, Presents, and Futures at The Ohio State University here in Columbus. Her research program is located in contradictions among transnational women's and disability rights frameworks in the context of global and regional imperialisms, as well as the proxy wars of the Middle East. Among the courses she teaches at OSU are global inequality, global human rights, disability experience in the contemporary world, and you teach at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, yes? Let me mention just a couple more things. In 2018, she received the honorable mention for the prestigious Irving K. Zola Award for Emerging Scholars in Disability Studies, and she is currently the associate editor for the Global Ideas section of the Review of Disability Studies, an international journal. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to you, and we will have time for questions, and you will take questions yourself.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming to this talk, and thank you for the generous introduction. All right. So today I want to talk to you about feminist solidarity, especially transnational feminist solidarity, and then we will go through what that means, actually, because there are words that we use: global, transnational, international, but we don't really know what we mean exactly, especially in the context of social action. So first, please let me honor the land we are on. I'd like to take this moment to honor and acknowledge our indebtedness to the mound builders, the Wyandot, Seneca, Cayuga, and the Erie peoples who originally lived in this area, now called Oberlin. Recognizing the wisdom of the elders, I extend my gratitude for their knowledge of the earth and sky, water and trees, and support our presence on this land. I also want to honor the labor that has gone into building this building the furniture, electronics we use today, and honor the exploitation of many people at whose cost we can sit here today in an air-conditioned room and talk about their pain. All right, so as you heard, I'm a disability studies activist scholar, so access means a great deal to me. If you would like me to lower or lower my voice or speak louder, it is okay to interrupt me and ask for that. Or if you want me to speak slowly, please do so. That's okay to interrupt. Feel free to move around and stretch. I myself, as you see, am pregnant, and sitting is very difficult for me, so you can stand or actually sit on the floor if you want. Feel free to leave the room if you have to. We honor every body, mind in this space. So what's the agenda for today? We will examine examples of disciplining the woman's body through dress codes as a form of state violence. I will tell you a story of my research on disability/injury/trauma as a social relation rather than a fixed biomedical category, and center the work of disabled survivors of violence like acid attack survivors. By the way, I forgot to mention that in the first slide that I showed you behind is my dear friend, an acid attack survivor, Masoumeh Ataei, Masoumeh who survived an acid attack 12 years ago by her father-in-law when she rejected, ex-father-in-law, when she rejected his sexual advances. She is blind in both eyes now and has decided to become a model, and now is the first model who is an acid survivor. And as you see in this photo, she has appeared unveiled, which is a crime under the Islamic Republic of Iran, and she can go to prison for that. However, she's brave enough to become a model and publicize these photos of herself without apologizing for her glowing beauty. So this is the work that I meant, like centering the work of disabled survivors of violence. That's what I meant. Also, we explore together what it means to have or to show solidarity with other people's movements and struggles and what that actually means. And eventually, I hope to challenge the theory and politics of particularism versus universalism, which I'm happy to explain further, which usually operates in the guise of respect for other cultures by examining its approach to gender relations in the Islamic Republic of Iran as an example, as a case study. This is an artwork by Shirin Neshat, Shireen I am spelling everything for access purposes. On the right, you see a photograph of a beautiful woman whose name is Yasaman Aryani. As you can see, the spelling is Yasaman Aryani. On March 8, 2019, International Women's Day, Yasaman Aryani and her mother took off their headscarves and walked through a woman-only train carriage in Tehran, handing out white flowers. Yasaman spoke of her hopes for a future when all women would have the freedom to choose what to wear. Shortly after, she was arrested and sentenced to 16 years in prison for, I quote, inciting and facilitating corruption and prostitution, unquote. Branch 54 of the Appeals Court of Tehran reduced the sentences of women's rights defenders like Yasaman and her mother, Monira Arabshahi, to 9 years and 7 months imprisonment. Their sentences are now composed of 5 years and 6 months for, again I quote, inciting and facilitating corruption and prostitution through promoting, and I quote, unveiling. 3 years and 6 months for, and I quote, gathering and colluding to commit crimes against national security, unquote. And 7 months for, and I quote, spreading propaganda against the system, unquote. Under Iran's sentencing guidelines, they have to serve the lengthiest single sentence imposed for the most serious charges, which is 5 years and 6 months for the crimes that I mentioned. Yasaman was operating as part of a campaign that started since 2018. So the strength of this unveiling movement has terrified the Iranian authorities, who have waged a sinister crackdown in response. Since January 28, when this particular campaign started, they have arrested at least 48 women rights defenders, including 4 men, who participated and supported these protests. On the left-hand side, you see Sabah Kordafshari, Sabea. She appeared without a headscarf and talked about it on social media. She was, I guess, barely 19 when she did that. She was arrested on August 2018. In August 2018, she was sentenced to 1 year in prison on the charging of, and I quote, disrupting the public order, unquote. At branch 28 of Tehran Revolutionary Court, led by Judge Moghisheh, Moghisheh, she was released on 14 February 79 when a bunch of prisoners were pardoned. On June 1st, 2019, Sabah was re-arrested. Her trial was held on August 19, 2019. On September 26, 2019, she was sentenced by Branch 26 of the Revolutionary Court of Tehran, presided over by Judge Afshari. Her sentences included 15 years of imprisonment of the charge of, and I quote, promoting corruption and prostitution through appearing without a headscarf in public. And add this to a long list of legal child marriage, femicide, beheading your daughter with no problem, with absolute impunity, and so on and so forth. So, clearly, a state-imposed veiling in Iran is an instrument of sexual apartheid. Add this to the list that we have been talking about, and think about these women's defiance and resistance. But something has remained hanging for me as someone who has witnessed this. The silence that we have received from our Western sisters in the West, in US, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, you name it. People who enjoy the relative freedom of not having a dress code, relatively, we can wear what we want, again, relatively. Our Western feminists, even women of color, even indigenous women, even black women, queer women, trans women, remain mostly indifferent, if not hostile, to our struggles. Why? It is true that in Turkey, Egypt, and Algeria, veiling is, for some women, one site of resistance against the secular state. But particularists confuse this anti-state struggle with resistance to patriarchy. And I'm happy to expand this further as we go through. But what's the history of forced veiling and dress code? Were women in Iran always like this? Under this much pressure and this much oppression? There has in fact been a long tradition of a struggle against the body cover, which is rooted in more than a century of democratic revolutionary movements in the Middle East and in Iran. Unlike the popular belief that we are always oppressed, that we've been always living like this, that's not true. For example, in the mid-19th century, the Babi movement called for the reform of religion and of the harsh treatment of women. Babi movement is basically the ancestor of Baha'i movement in Iran. For the reform of religion of the harsh treatment of women. One of the leaders, the female poet Tahireh Qurratul Ain, who lived in 1814 to 1854. Tahireh was probably best remembered for unveiling herself in an assemblage of men during the conference of Badasht. The unveiling caused much controversy, but the Bab, the founder of the Babi movement, named her, and I quote, the pure one, affirming his support for her. The Bab continued to highly praise Tahireh, and in one of his later writings equates Tahireh's station as equal to that of the 17 other male letters of the living combined. It's a special phrase, that special place for these people. She was soon arrested and placed under house arrest in Tehran. In mid-1852, she was executed in secret on account of her Babi faith and her unveiling. Before her death, it is believed that she declared, and I quote, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women." Although the movement was brutally suppressed, it continued to influence many intellectuals who, and I quote, wrote against women's subjugation in family and society and condemned the practice of veiling. Women participated in the constitutional revolution of 1906 to 1911, which is considered the first attempt in the global south towards establishing democracy. And it happened in Iran and is extremely important. Within 2 years of that, we had a movement in Turkey under Ottoman Empire. So they usually are said together, they are mentioned together. But the constitutional revolution is basically considered the first move towards establishing democracy in the non-Western world. Some of the targets of the women's liberation movement of the early 20th century were veiling, polygamy, and restrictions against women's right to education. By the early 1920s, the Iranian poet Mirzadeh Eshqi, who is a man, is in one of his best known poems, the Black Shroud, which is kafan siyah in Farsi, denounced the chador. Shroud is like coffin in Islamic culture. Called a chador, or the covering that covers your body, a coffin, a shroud for women. He was brave enough to say that. And then what happened? Something incredibly interesting happened. On January 8, 1936, in the Shia Muslim majority context of Iranian society, the Iranian king, the founder of Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Shah, who was a pro-Western monarch, issued a decree known as Kashf Hijab, which means unveiling. Contrary to widespread claims, the majority of women were not wearing the veil when the government launched the unveiling campaigns. The current government, Islamic Republic of Iran, they like to say, oh, Reza Shah was so bad because it enforced unveiling and took the hijab off women's head by force. That's true. He did that. But how many percentage of women were wearing a veil at a time? Perhaps 20%. But they presented as if all women were veiled, and that's not true. Contrary to widespread claims, the majority of women were not wearing the veil when the government launched the unveiling campaign. Confidential documents of the Pahlavi estate, published and declassified in the 1990s by the Islamic government, actually, revealed that women in rural and tribal areas, forming about 80% of the population, did not need to be unveiled because they never used the cover in the first place. In 1979, covering the female, after the 1979 when the revolution took place, covering the female body has been a major component of the existence of power by Islamic theocracies, from Iran to Afghanistan to Saudi Arabia, you name it. Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, Khomeini's mandatory hijab law resulted in Iranian women's widespread protest 17 days after the revolution as the first major force of resistance on the streets on March 8, 1979. They said, "Ma inqilab nakardim ta be aqab bargardim," which means we did not revolt to go back. They had understood Marx correctly. They wanted a revolution that takes them forward, not back to medieval times. But unfortunately, revolution has proved to work in both ways. It can also take you back, which my people experienced. Women poured into the street on March 8, 1979, whether with a hijab or without, marched side by side and demanded freedom of choice on the issue of wearing the hijab. Under this law, women must wear loose clothing, known as hijab, that covers the head and neck, as well as manteau. Manteau is like something that covers your body, not just the head and the neck. As well as, manteau. Women who don't comply are arrested by the morality police force. Morality police force. There is a police called morality police force that comes around. I was arrested by them at the age of 14. I'm glad to talk about it later in the Q&A. They also call themselves guidance patrols, whatever it is that they're guiding. Supported by the regime militias called Basij, and they are armed. They have weapons. Who consist of thousands of undercover agents to enforce the Islamic code of conduct in public. Iran's Islamic code, I should say, because no two people in the Islamic world agree. These are very divergent, very heterogeneous issues in the Islamic world even. Iranian women have been resisting this oppressive hijab law by wearing a thin and short veil that hardly covers the hair sometimes, especially in big cities, as well as tight clothing, or coats reaching mid-thigh, an ensemble often denounced by conservatives as bad hijab or bad veils, instead of a traditional chador that covers the whole body. The so-called bad veiling is a way for women to resist the oppressive order of mandatory hijab. Although women immediately resisted this oppressive order since 1979, were brutally suppressed by the regime thugs, as I mentioned, and left alone by the progressive leftists who thought this was not a priority for the revolution. Unfortunately, many leftist forces at the time thought, what about the workers' right? What about unions? What about social justice? Oh, who cares about your little wail? I remember my own grandmother, who was an educated woman, was a teacher. So was her mother. Was talking those, well, I wasn't born yet, but as my mom retells me, she was saying, oh, like, who cares about the, if imperialism is gonna, go away, if, the Shah is gonna go away, who cares about this little like, piece of cloth? Well, that piece of cloth is a tool of patriarchy. Imposed through state violence under the Islamic Republic of Iran, the veil has turned into a means of sexual apartheid. As I mentioned before, this is a quote from Shahzad Mojab, M-O-J-A-B, who wrote for the Monthly Review an incredible article in 1998 talking about this very issue. And women have been defined as state by violating all the official dress codes. We hear people refer to us, Middle Eastern, as Muslim women, which is very strange. We don't do that to any other group. Do we say Christian women in the West? We don't. We say Western women. Suddenly geography becomes religion, religion becomes geography. I don't even understand. The category of Muslim women construct a unidimensional woman whose consciousness or identity is shaped by one factor only, religion. Islam is not a race or ethnicity. It's an idea. You can subscribe to it or not. Contrary to popular belief, it is okay to criticize the veil. Even if all Muslim women voluntarily used it. There is nothing holy and sacred about veiling, Islamic or non-Islamic. Let's get this straight. Reducing women to their religion is Orientalist and fundamentalist. The authenticity of the culture of not veiling, practiced by the majority of Iranian women, the culture of anti-veiling, the feminist and secular traditions of Iranians, and ignore the demands of non-Muslim Iranians. So this is what it happens when you use the category of Muslim women, Muslim women. The new era. In January 2018, at the beginning I mentioned to you the movement that started, that Yasaman Afshari and Sabakord Afshari were arrested. In January 2018, after struggling against the implications of, decade-long nuclear sanctions due to Iran's nuclear adventures and sponsoring terrorism in the region, as well as widespread corruption and poverty, people once again poured into the streets of Iran and demanded an end to the economic, social, and political problems preventing them from having freedom, prosperity, and a democratic society. For a country that owns 4% of the world's natural resources, it shouldn't be very difficult. From that struggle, the mandatory hijab protest was empowered and grew out of its passive resistance status. I call it passive resistance because since the Islamic Revolution, women have resisted the mandatory hijab law, like I told you, by removing their veil at home, parties, gatherings where there are both men and women present. Although parties with men and women present is not illegal, it is not legal in Iran. You can get arrested for it. But people do it as a resistance. To oppose, my husband sometimes asks me, why are you guys dancing on the bus? When we go somewhere, we start dancing on the bus, like on a road trip. I'm like, we are resisting, man. That's why. To oppose the state-mandated cover-up laws, they wear tiny scarves that cover only some parts of their hair, like I said, or they wear colorful scarves because the government doesn't like colorful. They are very strict on the color of being dark always, as opposed to the state-preferred colors, black and gray. Additionally, to resist the state's policing of their bodies, they wear makeup, tight jeans, and short manto. Manto, that Islamic covering. Despite the massive and costly resistance, many Westerners treat hijab, mandatory hijab, as if it is a democratically ratified law in Iran. They even wear hijab when they go to Iran. Federica Mogherini, Federica Mogherini, for instance, the foreign minister of European Union, or foreign policy maker of European Union, I should say, the previous one, walked on the stage in the Islamic Parliament wearing a veil. When women go to prison for 16 years on unveiling, a woman who doesn't have to do it does it. Why? Which infuriated many women's rights activists across the globe. Many justified what she did as obeying the law. Others claimed that oppressing women should not be a law, and if it has become by force, it shouldn't be respected at all. Slavery was once a law. So was the racial apartheid in South Africa. Then, with this logic, Gandhi and Mandela and Rosa Parks are to blame for not obeying the law. The protests involving a white cloth on a wooden stick, as you see, gave a new face to this active resistance. As soon as the mainstream media, as well as the popular social media, captured a glimpse of these women holding their sticks while standing on high ground and saying nothing verbally, absolute silence, just holding it. The state cracked down on these women wherever they found them. They arrested them on the spot, or later on chased them down and arrested them in their homes. The state continues to arrest them. The women are interrogated, tortured, and sometimes released after a few days of continuous interrogation, after which they will have to appear in court and receive a sentence. In one such incident, a woman who refused to stop her peaceful protest was pushed down and thrown on the ground by a police officer. We also know about Saba and Yasaman, whom I told you about. Both in their 20s are among those women who unveiled publicly and received a sentence of more than 20 years in prison, which was reduced then to 7 years and 10 years. This happens while Basij, the paramilitary forces, the militia I told you, BASIJ, who threw acid on women who, according to them, were bad-veiled in the city of Esfahan, where I grew up, Esfahan, were never arrested. Romina Afshari's father, who beheaded his innocent teenage daughter by a sickle, didn't spend a day in prison, and instead walked by just paying a diya, which is a blood money, according to Islamic criminal law, for beheading his daughter, who was a child bride. If you don't observe your hijab, then you will be sprayed with acid. This is an anonymous text message received by a woman in Iran whom the Iranian Students' News Agency identified as Hanieh. As of October 2014, at least 8, some believe that the number was 13, acid attacks occurred in Isfahan, leaving one woman dead and many more with severe burns to their face and hands and blinded in one or both eyes. These women were all driving when they were attacked. An Iranian journalist, Elahe Amani, Amani, wrote, and I quote, "They were accused of being bad hijab, or those with bad veiling, claiming they were sullying their family's honor by committing indecent behavior. The families of the women do not come forward, though, afraid of the possible consequences of accusing the Islamic State of anything. It is a typical characteristics of a totalitarian state to frighten its citizens to maintain power, quoting Hannah Arendt. People are always petrified that the state may commit more violent acts against them and their loved ones. The chain attacks in this particular time in Esfahan raised fears and prompted rumors that the victims were targeted for not being properly veiled. Because at first you don't know, you're just driving your car, suddenly someone comes and throws acid on your face and runs away. They are still traumatized 7 years later. Well, this would be more than that. This is when I was writing my book. This is a few years later now. And no one has ever been arrested regarding these attacks. So imagine the sentences that Sabah and Yasaman got for unveiling and what's happening with these people. So my question is, now I'm going to get into some critique of Western feminism here, since we have gotten together to do transnational solidarity. I can go on and on and on about this forever. I've lived in this society for 20 years, so it's not that I'm here talking about it. I'm in exile, and I know the context. People here in the West, namely Canada and US, which I'm most familiar with, the North American side, are exposed to this information on a daily basis. As with technology, all around the world, all the world's news is accessible with just a click or a tap. We have been fascinated, me and many of my allies and feminist sisters, with how silent feminists have been in the face of these atrocities committed against women who protest mandatory hijab. And I don't mean a right-wing women. I'm talking about my own people, my circles, critical leftist circles. Oh, obviously, I'm not even talking about those right-wing ones. I have two hypotheses as to why women, especially Euro-Atlantic, Western Europe, Canada, Canadian, and US, feminist women, have remained silent. One reason could be the spread of what has been known as Islamophobia in the West. And I will explain why I'm doing this. Perhaps they think it's possibly incorrect or politically incorrect to defend women's rights to resist Sharia law in a Muslim majority country. Again, coming back to calling countries based on religion, which is ridiculous. Does the phrase Muslim majority mean that majority of people actually practice Islam in Iran? To be honest with you, the major spirit in the Middle East is pretty secular. Unlike how we are called by people here. Muslim women, Muslim majority, Islamic culture, Islamic art. Even if that is the case, and some people practice their religion, does this mean that the state can persecute women who don't want to observe this law? One could say perhaps secular Middle Eastern women cannot even exist in the Western imagination. Read a colonized notion. Why can leftist or secular women not exist in the Western imagination of Middle Eastern women? Why are Kurdish guerrilla fighters in military uniforms holding AK-47s who fought and defeated ISIS never portrayed as Middle Eastern women? But women in hijab are. George W. Bush administration, to justify the early phase of the war on terror, tried to convince the world that he was on a feminist mission to rescue Afghan women. This pity for Middle Eastern women and fear of the Middle Eastern men has become a common trope in North American literature and culture, especially after 9/11. Can we move outside this pity, fear tropes, which are usually the spinning wheels of the liberal ideology encountering the Orient? Rachel Gorman explains that the West, based on its liberal ideology, pities first then fears, and then pities again. The victims of imperialist wars in the Middle East. Apologists, on the other hand, explain that those women, those whom the Western media calls terrorists, are simply those who oppose Western racism. The left explains that the regimes which denounce the US are the regimes that stand against imperialism. Therefore, women like me don't exist, and indeed cannot exist, in the conceptual universe of the Western left. And therefore, it is impossible for the Western left to grasp the contradictions that women like me face. The anti-imperialist wars and patriarchal nationalisms that characterize my reality as a victim of both kinds of state terror are invisible. The actions that I take to confront my realities are inscrutable. My other hypothesis pertains only to the leftist secular women, namely socialist, materialist, Marxist feminists, my own allies. They appear to be on the side of the Iranian state, simply because the Iranian state comes across as resisting the US imperialism. They simplistically conclude that as long as a nation-state resists the US empire's global and economic expansion, then it is a revolutionary state who works in favor of anti-imperialist struggles globally. The first problem with this interpretation is that it does not engage with regional politics in its analysis of the Middle East, and does not pay attention to the power game resembling the Cold War which is taking place in the region, where the US and China and Russia compete for resources and military alliances. This happens partially through not listening to us, women who have lived in the region and know the politics of regional imperialisms better. Iran, for instance, engages in regional imperialism all the time. Turkey engages in imperialism. In fact, competes with US and Chinese and Russian empire. Not that it's resisting it. By refusing to listen, they form their own hypothesis, which transforms into a dogmatic ideology and later abstraction, resisting any modification and correction. This is not only colonizing our political analysis, but constantly silencing us and not paying attention to what we have to say. It's also what I call imperialist feminism, where some women have the power to silence other women in both the academy and outside it. This type of imperial expansion happens through discursive relations with material consequences for the oppressed. When the left assumes that there is only one type of imperialism, and that's US imperialism, it abysmally fails to properly scrutinize the regional politics that lead to regional imperialisms. The leftist feminists assume that somehow there is an imperial expansion of Iran in the region without actual imperialism. This becomes oppressive to women like me, who have resisted the Iranian state's terror, both in forms of regional imperialism and theocratic nationalism, as well as Western and Eastern imperialisms, all at the same time. By Eastern, I mean the Eastern Bloc, and the aggressions of Russia right now proving that. Or the neo-colonial behavior of China, or how Uyghur Muslims are being sterilized in concentration camps. So, all these forces, they appear as though they oppose each other. Secular feminists from the region have shown us that these so-called opposing forces actually work together and often converge at times as they play out in the real world and affect Middle Eastern women's lives. In fact, they work in the same direction to rob women of their political agency and to reduce them to either women who need policing or otherwise to be rescued. This becomes poignant when my comrades and I witness that our American and Canadian feminist sisters also do not pay attention to what we have to say. it seems unavoidable that our analyses as women who resist theocratic nationalism and imperialisms are overridden by analyses produced by our feminist sisters who never care about what we have to say. I know I have to end soon, so we can have some time for Q&A. I just want to end by a quote from Bell Hooks, who passed recently, and I think that would be a nice honoring of her legacy. Bell Hooks said, and I quote, "There's a particular knowledge that comes from suffering. It is a way of knowing that is often expressed through the body, what it knows, what has been deeply inscribed on it through experience. This complexity of experience can rarely be voiced and named from distance. It is a privileged location, even as it is not the only or even always the most important location from which we can know." Thank you. Very good question. I'm 35 and a half. I moved to Canada when I was 20. So when I lived in the Middle East, we barely had those, when I was 14, 15, I had my mom had a computer, and then it was like those weird alien sounds, like analog, yeah. At the time, if there was a protest, we couldn't know about it because I lived through the student movement, that I heard a gunshot for the first time in my life and tear gas. You couldn't talk about it online because there was no proper chat rooms like we enjoy today. But then I want to fast forward it to 2009. After the post-election war in Iran, I was already in Canada, and I could watch people pouring into the streets, getting killed, getting shot even, from Twitter videos, which suddenly revolutionized the culture of transnational solidarity. I'm very glad you asked this question. Absolutely, people were showing solidarity with us, although President Obama said, "Oh, it's very heartbreaking that Neda Agha Sultan died on the streets." That's it. Anyways, that's state support for you. You don't get the state support. But people were very sympathetic about what was going on. And it was Twitter, it was live video, well, not live like the Instagram live, we still didn't have that, but people would take a video and then try to email it. At the time, we didn't have any other Dropbox or Google. Now, they can show you live what's happening. So what a state has been doing in this most recent one, you remember in 2019, it shut off the internet for a week. So people couldn't send videos of the protests. So that's a fantastic question. I think technology has, from both parts. Also, state is using its technology to do surveillance of activists. It goes both ways. It can track them better. It can hack websites better to human rights agencies. It can track them down better. Yeah. I hope that answered your question somehow. Thank you. Sorry, can you say your name?
I'm Ali.
Ali, please.
I'm from India, and we have a majority Hindu state or Hindu population, and the government, which is like Hindu fundamentalists, often uses the unveiling of Muslim women as an excuse, basically to, they pretend, or under the guise of feminism, they will enforce laws, but actually their intentions are just to marginalize Muslims even more, and
Absolutely, absolutely. So see, this happens, and that's why at first I mentioned Turkey and Algeria and some other examples. Every struggle should be looked at in its own context, but at the same time, this doesn't mean that we can be peculiarists. So, there's this discussion between universalism and peculiarism, where in universalism we say human rights are universal, they apply to every person. Every person should live with dignity, with no discrimination. They should decide what they want to wear, what they not to wear. But then peculiarists say, oh, maybe female genital mutilation is not bad in this community and it's bad in that community. Well, that gets ridiculous because then they actually feed the state ideology. Like Imran Khan recently, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, said, oh, don't worry about Afghan girls' education. In some cultures, that's not just appropriate. That is peculiarism, right? Oh, respect cultures. Every culture is... No, right? That is ridiculous. But what about women? Asking women themselves what they think. Their own consciousness, their collective will and consciousness. They know. They know it. We don't have to sit here and decide what they think. We can ask them. You are telling us what is going on. You are someone from the community or from the context who is telling us why this is happening, telling us about their consciousness. So now we know what is going on in the context. Then we can frame it as a struggle, as a anti-state struggle. But then if Federica Mogherini wears a stupid cloth and goes to Iranian parliament, and many other Western politicians, I call it hypocrisy. It's like also oppressing women even more with their own hands. Like, oh, you went to prison for 20 years for unveiling and I can come here unveiled, but I'm going to wear a veil to police all these men who run the country? No problem. Yeah, that's a very good question. We have to be very context specific as we analyze the stories. But again, not fall into peculiarism, like, oh, it's okay in this context, but not in that. Very good question. Thank you. Anyone else? Please, Christine.
Christina, yes.
Christina.
Thank you. If there are more student questions, that would be great. Let me just ask, are there examples of solidarity, even small or minimal level,
Yes.
that you can point to that would be examples of a good way forward?
That is actually a very good question. Unfortunately, because of these dominant ideologies around Islam, like I didn't get a chance to talk about why I oppose the word Islamophobia as someone from the Islamic culture, Muslim descent, is because Islam is an idea and not a race or ethnicity. You can be Muslim phobic, which is bad. It's like homophobic, but you can be afraid of Islam. It's completely fine to be afraid of an idea. I am afraid of Islam. You can have to critique it, deconstruct it, like Foucault and Derrida taught us. No problem. Critique the hell out of it. That's not a problem. We should be able to critique ideas, but not hate people. Those are very different things. That's why I oppose even the word Islamophobia, because what's wrong with fearing an idea? That's not a problem. But fearing people is. So in this context, many people are afraid to show their solidarity because of this Islamophobia thing that has become very dominant, even though they have sympathy for us, for secular women like me who oppose that theocratic state violence. However, we have received, like the fact that you have invited me to talk here is an example of transnational solidarity. You wanted to hear my pain and my consciousness, my political consciousness as a woman. And the ones who have come here, men or women or whatever, you have come here to listen to what I have to say. That's an example of starting to build solidarity, I think. But it's very alienating and very hard. And I can tell you why. Because academia, unfortunately, has a very cultish culture. Academia can be very alienating in a sense that you have to belong to one camp or the other. You can critique the hell out of one state in the Middle East, but not touch the other ones. And I don't agree with that, because then this is double standards, and then I find it very hard to have my voice heard. But again, there's a small solidarity here and there that we receive. For example, in disability studies, which is my own field, I have tried to infuse my voice, and it has not been easy. It has not been easy at all, because the understanding of disability that women have here, not women, anybody has, is usually an accident or a congenital. They have a hard time understanding these women. What is this? This is not a biomedical disability. This is violence. This is a social relation. This is a political act. This is not just breaking your leg. This is patriarchy. This is theocracy. This is a state supporting this injury of women or creating trauma. Trauma in Greek means wound, wounding people. But it's a very lonely journey, if that's what I think you're asking. For example, the 1988, a lot of atrocities that have happened to my people since the revolution. A lot of these people who were killed were socialist, communist activists, leftist activists, students, just like us. But people don't have sympathy for them because they think if they talk about Islamic State violence, they are committing Islamophobia. But we should be able to go beyond ideologies, no matter who accepts that in their camps. We have to be on the side of the oppressed. Always. I think you had a question.
Well, more a comment.
Sure.
I'm from Eastern Europe, so I sympathize with your point of view. So the Western left is basically repeating the paradigm, except now it's even worse because it's rendered worse intellectually by its relativistic attitude towards values.
Mm-hmm.
But during the Cold War and, for a long time afterwards, we could not really condemn state socialism because even though there were abuses of human rights in the Soviet Union,
Mm-hmm.
It was still the great hope of the future in some kind of perverted form. For the longest time, there was no criticism first of Stalin, then there was no criticism of the Soviet Union, then there was an infatuation with Mao Zedong, and then the Western left, unfortunately, because so many people in it were well-meaning, indirectly became a tool of the Soviet regime.
Absolutely.
So, for example, unfortunately and sadly, parts of the fundamentalist parts of the Green movement in Germany who were for peace and protesting Reagan's, policy of putting middle-range rockets in Europe, that was a principled stance for peace. The only problem was that the Soviets exactly wanted them to do that, right?
Yeah.
So this is repeating itself many times over. So, and the problem, you hit on the problem, I agree with you that we must understand context, as this example made clear, and therefore make our judgments with a knowledge of the context. But at the same time, we cannot abandon universal rights.
Absolutely.
The idea of universal rights. Either they apply to the Ukrainians and the Bosnian Muslims and the Iranian
Absolutely.
women, or they don't. And that should be unambivalent. But it's not, because, everything that the West does is horrible, and everything that, Islamic State does or whatever is just a response to, historical abuse by Western countries. And that, of
Exactly.
course,
That's how it is framed.
and that's from those of us who lived in such regimes or studied them like I did, it's just devastating, actually.
Absolutely.
It's devastating, and the sooner the Western left wakes up to this reality, maybe the Russian aggression in Ukraine will change something. And now that narrative is also, it's all because of
NATO!
all because of NATO expansion.
NATO is provoking Russia!
All because of NATO expansion. Therefore, providing another justification, right? Indirectly. So it's more by way of a comment. And the other thing about context, which touches directly on feminism, and this was the same problem as in Eastern Europe. And there was a great misunderstanding between Western feminists and East European dissidents. historically in the 80s and 90s before communism fell. Women wanted to wear makeup. They wanted to look beautiful. They wanted to wear pantyhose. Okay, they wanted to do all the things that the Western feminists considered backward because they were not available to them. The economic goods were not available to them. The possibility of choosing your dress code was not available to them. Okay, not because the state banned it, but because the consumption goods
Exactly,
were
it wasn't
unavailable.
there. Yeah.
So, you know, and great misunderstandings occurred because, no, here are women reverting back to their traditional roles. Sure, some are. And some are seeing this as liberation from the drab Soviet dress code.
Exactly.
You know, so this is just a comment more to the student audience than to you because I think you understand it very well. But here, for some reason, this view is, you know, very prevalent. And it's very difficult, as you pointed out yourself, I can imagine, to break through the wall of misunderstanding.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it has been very difficult. I was going to talk about magic circles. You know, like imagine like you draw a circle on the sand, and then you are just inside it. Because if you walk outside it, then you're suddenly very lonely. And that's exactly what happens in intellectual traditions and academia. Because you need allies. That's how ideas work. Otherwise, no emancipation ever happens by one person saying, this is what I think. Never. We always need collectives. We always need building coalitions. We always need people to be on our side. So it's very, I appreciate you acknowledging that. It is a very lonely journey. And it's funny, I called this section of my book, Resisting Erasure. Because that's exactly how I felt. But I'm very grateful for this opportunity that I got to talk to you. Do you have any questions for me? Any comments? Any examples? Any clarifications? I, by the way, have a final slide that kind of summarizes the things we talked about in terms of, the construction of the category of Muslim women or nothing sacred about hijab, and it's okay to criticize it. I see people treating hijab as like not understanding apartheid. So when we say South African apartheid, the whole world got together, they built a collective force, and they sanctioned South Africa. They put really hard sanctions on South Africa, and people knew it. People in South Africa knew it, that this was the price to pay for their freedom. But racial apartheid receives attention while gender apartheid, sexual apartheid doesn't. Why? In Iran, we have to go to different schools. We can only go to men and women combined classrooms in university. So after kindergarten, you have to wear a hijab, which is at the age of 7, which is even in Sharia, it says 9, because you can get married at the age of usually 9, but now I think it's 13. They have made it 13. And anyways, wear hijab, be separate from men, go to separate schools, separate buses. Even in buses, like before civil rights era in the U.S., you have to use women should use the back of the bus, and men use the front of the bus. This is segregation. If this is not segregation, what is segregation? Why can't we talk about apartheid in this context? This is sexual apartheid. This is gender apartheid. And enforcing a dress code on women, men don't have to cover their heads. Only women have to. You know why? Because ideologically they think that there's a difference between men and women, and that men can be aroused and provoked by women's hair and body, but women cannot be aroused and provoked by men's body. So an essentialist difference, which is in women's and gender studies, we laugh at that, because that's not true. Statistically and scientifically, that's wrong. Women and men don't have any difference in their sexual desires, and the amount of it is statistically insignificant amount, under 0.05%. I was a math major. So, So yes.
What do you think about,
Sorry.
is there anyone else?
Well,
Oh,
Go ahead.
it's not a question.
your
that-
name, please.
My name's Tessia, or Tejaswini.
Tessia.
Tessia.
Beautiful. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been just having this internal reevaluation when you were speaking about Western women coming into the space and wearing a veil, thinking that this is a sign of
Emancipation.
respect of the norms or emancipation, or just this this funny thing of that I grew up kind of with feet between the Western world and India, and whenever I was there in India with my mother, who's my Western parent, and I wasn't raised really by my dad, she has always raised me that it was a sign of respect to be covered, and that when we were out and seeing other Westerners visiting who are out in tank tops and shorts, that was super disrespectful to everybody around them, and that was this massive lack of self-awareness moving through a space that isn't your own. But my mom experienced brutal violence while living there as well as a woman.
Wow.
That is, you know, it's something that you're aware of there growing up, and not being out by yourself, and like colorism and being noticed in certain ways for being affiliated with the Western world. Like there was always this thing of like, it's for your own good to hide yourself and your own safety, and it's also respectful.
Pearl in a shell.
And it's
That's the propaganda usually they say. You have to
Yeah.
cover yourself because you're a pearl in a shell.
yeah, and it's just this, like I've been wanting to go back to India a lot recently, and have always thought about what it will take for me to be able to move there independently, because it's so hard to think about doing that, knowing what happened to my mom when she was there independently. But then it's also like, I want to take these steps to be hyper aware and self-critical of learned behaviors and things like that, so that when I move through that space, I'm doing it in a way that is as brave as possible, and as genuine as possible to what my intentions are, to be somebody who would be an ally or ready to do real work. But I don't know what advice you would give to somebody who's trying to balance doing that and realize the potential dangers, or the potential imminent dangers to your own safety, and like what ways to do that, coming from the privilege of this education and like what I can wear and financial privilege to be able to travel there and leave if I needed to. Just how to navigate that as somebody who,
Allie, do you want to respond to this?
Wow, I don't know. You made me think of a lot of things. But like I grew up in India, so I have a completely different perspective. And I mean, I definitely joke about it. I grew up in the city that's the rape capital of the world. So I don't know. So I feel like those are things I've been very aware of, but also it's my home, and that's where I'm most comfortable. So it's like balancing a lot of things. And
Contradictions.
and what you were saying about feeling about how when foreigners come visit and they're dressed differently from other people, that's something that I've always thought of as very disrespectful. And not just women, men too. Like when they're wearing something that's very different, but maybe I have to reevaluate that. I don't know.
Yeah, well, think about it the other way around.
Yeah.
If when people wear a sari here in the West, do we find that disrespectful, or is it politically correct to find that disrespectful? Maybe we can think about it that way. We talk about multiculturalism all the time, accepting people. Always, we can put ourselves in their shoes and see. Because often we live here, we critique the hell out of it. But when we get to other people's cultures, we are suddenly like frozen in time and space. We are not intellectuals anymore. We're like, oh, we are very nice, you know. But what about your critical thinking? Where did it go? I have been there. I just want to make this clear. It's not that I was like this from the beginning. I mean, this has been a journey for me to even, to develop this critical consciousness. But you nailed it yourself. You said being genuine and brave.
But how?
Those are the foundations of political consciousness. And it is your journey to evaluate those. It will be your journey to equip yourself with readings, good books, good articles, having good allies, attending good talks. And that will be your weapon going forward. Because many people have struggled at these intersections before you. That's what happens when we read. We read other people's struggles without having to pay the price.
I mean, I think it's also about understanding the history of liberalism and the separation between church and state.
Exactly.
You need to develop consciousness, but you also need to come to a point politically where you give people choices. You give people choices to veil if they want to, or not to veil. That's what's lacking in Iran. You don't give people those choices. You have
And
to,
also the fact that the choice should be given from the state
that's right.
is a huge problem, right? I mean, here we talk about defunding the police.
Right.
We get very angry, we go out, we shout, we say defund the police. But we never talk about defunding the moral police. We suddenly freeze. We don't say anything. We are critical, for example, of some states in the Middle East. We are critical of Israel, for instance. But we never apply the same criticism to an Islamic government. We call it a colonial state. Do we call the United States a colonial state, or Canada or Australia? These are colonial states. I mean, they're indigenous people who have been massacred, genocided, segregated in residential schools. So what should we do? Just leave? Just throw ourselves in the ocean? What do we do? So they can be emancipated? We have to, I am absolutely pro-sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty, but I'm saying not have double standards. At least when it comes to these contexts, be allies with people who are living that life and see how it is affecting them, what they want to do. But never respect patriarchy. Never. Never respect patriarchy, never respect the state, never respect authority. And always, I think, what is Christopher Hitchens' quote that I love? You know, I have it on my phone. If you give me 1 second, I can bring it up. This is one of my very favorite quotes of Christopher Hitchens. Mockery of religion is one of the most essential things, one of the beginnings of human emancipation, is the ability to laugh at authority. There's nothing sacred about ideas. As intellectuals, as people who come to university is not a church or a mosque or a synagogue or anywhere that you sit down and worship. University is sacred because you can rip ideas apart, mock them, destroy them, and build them again. And that's the beauty of science and knowledge and being able to critique. That's how we grow. That's how we go forward. By worshipping ideas, we never go forward. Any other questions for me? Yes, Christine.
Tell us about your book. When is it coming out? Has it come out? What is it?
Oh, the very good
So we
question.
can all get it.
My goodness. I was thinking, this has been such a special occasion for me, especially sitting with college students. I was thinking of definitely bringing one as a gift to you, to your department, but it is called Disabling Relations, Injured Body, Minds, and Active Witnessing. So it is coming out. It will go under in production by June. I am just waiting for the final approvals before it's go in production. So in it, I talk about war, acid attacks, prison violence, incarceration, and acquiring injuries in prison, disabilities in prison. And at the end, I talk about my own engagement with those populations, with acid survivors, prison survivors, war survivors, and how that has changed my life in profound ways, building relationships with these communities and learning from them. That's what I call active witnessing. The second part of the subtitle, that's what it means. Acting upon your witnessing, doing something about what you witness, not just be an audience. We have not come here to be audience, we are here to do things. So that's the book. I will have to make sure to.
We'll get it for the library, and we will, I don't know, do an announcement or something. Or you come back next time, and once your book is out, you give another talk.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That would be fantastic, actually. Thank you so much for listening, staying all this time with me. Thank you so much for your contributions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you. That would be fantastic. I'll wait for it. Bye.